cry echoed throughout the simulated night on board the A-36 airship, interplanetary spaceship of the Albion Imperial Space Service passenger and freight line. The cry was followed by several moans and sobs. It was clearly a woman's voice, and she was just as clearly in a great deal of distress. These sounds were coming from the rear section of the ship's passenger gondola, first-class accommodation. A final scream erupted from the same mysterious, tortured individual, far louder than those which had preceded it. If they had not already been awakened by the previous outbursts, this ultimate cry was heard even by the party from the Albion Imperial Museum in standard class. This included the Doctor and Romana. The two Time Lords poked their heads out from between the curtains of their bunk bed berth and stared aft towards the rear of the gondola, trying to trace the source of the voice. Between standard and first class lay the observation lounge, which also served as a dining room for the ship's passengers. Both here and in the corridors to either side, only a few lamps were on to give the subdued lighting appropriate to the hours of darkness. As such, neither the Time Lords nor the other companions, Lou, Nathan and Timmy, whose heads had now joined theirs in curious vigil, could make out anything in the dimness of the first-class corridor. The scream must have been loud enough to reach the crew quarters, since the door to the flight deck eased open. Through it peered the ship's passenger liaison officer and steward, Sub-Lieutenant Philip Leslies. The Doctor was about to engage him in conversation, to try and persuade him to investigate the strange cries with them, when all such persuasion became redundant. A tearing, crashing sound came from the direction of first class. This was followed by an oddly slapping, scuttling noise. Naturally, from that distance and in the poor illumination, they could see nothing of the cause. The Doctor hopped down from the top bunk, burst completely through the curtains, and stood facing the Sub-Lieutenant, hands on hips, jacket flapping around him. The steward stepped fully through the door to the flight deck and closed it quietly after him. He turned and beamed cheerfully at the Doctor, awaiting any requests. "I assume you're going to find out what all that was about?" the Doctor asked him firmly. Philip Leslies continued to beam reassuringly at him.
"Oh, hello. The Doctor, isn't it? So lovely to see you again. Find out? Oh, you mean all those odd noises? Well, I suppose I should take a little peek. Passengers in distress and all that. Right up my alley, so to speak. Rather."
The Doctor gave him room to pass as he headed aft, but then fell into step immediately behind him. Romana kept pace with the Doctor, while Nathan, Lou and Timmy were only a step or two behind. They walked through the dining area until they were next to the small galley compartment which filled a section just prior to the first-class corridor itself. As they passed the open entrance to this kitchen, the Doctor thought he heard a faint scratching sound coming from within. "Excuse me, Sub-Lieutenant, but does this ship have a rat problem?" The steward looked a little perplexed by this unexpected question.
"Rats, sir? I hardly think we'd allow that. The captain likes a tight ship, and that includes all the foodie stuff, too. Yes, we have a ship's cat keeping everything tickety-boo in the rodent department. Never seen a rat or mouse on board, so he must be doing a splendid job."
Romana frowned.
A cat sounds very sweet. But much like your rats and mice, I've not seen any sign of it.
Philip Leslies beamed at her.
"Oh, he almost never leaves the galley. He knows where the food is. Crikey, not that I mean the galley's full of rodents,"
he added hurriedly.
"I just mean he knows where his Me-Is cat food is kept. Terrific brand, by the way. He is a Me-Is cat, it seems. Rest assured, we don't have any rats or mice on board the A-36.
The Doctor nodded to himself, satisfied as to the source of those sounds at least. They now moved on to the first-class corridor proper. Walking beyond the cabin previously occupied by Dr. Nugatti and his manservant, they saw an inexplicable scene of wreckage and destruction. On the side of the corridor which had previously homed Rongad the Argond, next door to his former room in fact, there was a ragged hole torn through that cabin's door. The hole started at ground level and was roughly circular, about 1.5 feet in diameter. While the door was made of lightweight materials, thin panels of some plastic-like substance, with some aluminium struts to reinforce them, it was clear the hole had been made with quite some force. It was also evident from the shards and fragments littering the corridor that it had been blown out from the inside. "Whose room is this?" the Doctor asked as they stared at the still-closed door.
"Oh, I say, I do hope she's all right,"
Sub-Lieutenant Leslie said with some concern, his smile eradicated for the time being.
She?
Romana asked.
Oh, yes, rather. Certainly she. Oh, I see what you mean. Who she? She is the beautiful and vivacious Marina Della Mare.
Philip Leslie's was beaming once more as he identified the owner of the cabin. Everyone else was rather nonplussed by the revelation. Everyone except Nathan Ivon.
Marina Della Mare?
The detective gasped, unable to hide his shock.
Do you know her?
Professor Halbert asked. Nathan's expression morphed from shock to panic.
Well, not personally, of course. Never met her, but she is a rising star of the stage, so I understand. A jazz singer, I heard. Apparently she's about to break in big in the movies. Surely you must have heard of her?
Lou looked puzzled by his explanation.
No, never heard of her. I suppose I don't spend as much time as you, or Arthur, or Timmy, chasing the latest bright young thing to hit the theatres.
She pronounced airily.
I've never heard of her either.
Timmy said sullenly.
Well, I guess in my line of work it pays to keep an eye on the gossip columns.
Nathan said defensively.
And watching the theatre folks tends to just be day-to-day preparation. You'd be surprised how often they end up in one case or another.
Everyone seemed to feel this topic had run its course and looked back to the ruined door. The doctor studied Nathan for a moment longer, then also turned his attention back to the cabin. I don't think we're going to learn much more from out here. Sub-Lieutenant, perhaps we should look inside? Make sure Miss Delamere is safe and unharmed. The doctor suggested helpfully to the steward.
Oh, I say, rather toot sweet.
With that, Leslie's fumbled with his keys for a moment before selecting one, trying it, discovering it was the wrong one, before finally trying another and successfully opening the door. The inside of the cabin was messy, but disarray aside, looked as one might expect for a moderately successful independent woman travelling alone. There were a couple of trunks against the right wall, with some dresses, mostly white, dangling from the rail above them. It was the bed attached to the left-hand wall which gave the first hints of the unexpected. The covers were thrown almost completely off the bed, hanging partially onto the floor, but by far the most unusual feature was the complete absence of Marina Delamere.
Crikey!
Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's cried.
Where has she got to?
He then glanced at the wrecked door.
Do you think she left through there?
He asked, pointing to the ragged hole. The doctor raised his eyebrows. I think it's a bit of a tight squeeze for your average adult Albion. Not impossible, perhaps, but certainly a less than elegant exit, I suspect. More importantly, I doubt any ordinary Albion could have thrown themselves through the door at floor level, certainly not without considerable help and damage. Philip Leslie's frowned as he attempted to assimilate this molehill of new information. While this exchange had been going on, Romana had been examining the bed more closely.
Tell me, Mr. Leslies, was Miss Delamere pregnant?
The reactions of those gathered in that tiny room were surprisingly varied. The doctor simply gave a hint of a knowing smile and a nod of approval. Lou and Timmy both frowned, trying to understand the sense in her question. Nathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish, while his eyes darted to and fro as if looking to escape. Only the steward himself seemed to treat it as a normal everyday question.
Oh, I say, rather not. She was as svelte and sleek as a cat when she came on board,
he announced cheerfully. With these words, Nathan's mouth closed and his demeanour seemed to calm a fraction. Then the sub-lieutenant frowned, as a thought had the temerity to elbow its way into his head.
Although she did seem to take quite a liking to the ship's food. Not that the galley's service isn't top-notch, as you all know, but she did seem to be piling on the pounds rather quickly over the last few days. Quite astounding, really.
Yes, the cook must be very pleased, the doctor said slowly and thoughtfully. Then he turned to Romana. Why did you ask? Romana patted the sheets on the bed.
I was reminded of something poor Penny Cowley said earlier in our voyage, about seeing someone in the early stages of pregnancy, a woman in white. Then there's the state of this bed. It's a complete mess, sheets pulled everywhere. And they are drenched in sweat and possibly other fluids to judge from the feel and smell of it.
Several of the others grimaced at these observations, while the doctor simply nodded approvingly once more. Nathan looked worried again.
All very interesting and anatomical,
Lou chipped in impatiently.
but this does nothing to solve the mystery of the missing woman, the destruction of the door, or what danger the ship, passenger and crew might be in.
Quite so, Lou, the doctor agreed, a little frostily. I suggest we start by searching the immediate vicinity for signs of Miss Delamere and whatever did this to the door, assuming they're not one and the same. Everybody filed out of the room and back into the first-class corridor. I recommend we split up to cover more ground, the doctor said briskly. Perhaps the good sub-lieutenant could search aft with Lou and Timmy, while Romana, Nathan and myself search the galley and dining area. There were no objections, and so the party split. As the two Time Lords and Nathan began to carefully study the corridor for clues, all the while moving in the direction of the dining room, Romana looked unusually pleased by something. Eventually the doctor's curiosity got the better of him. Romana, what are you thinking about? Romana's mind had clearly been elsewhere, and she gave a sheepish smile as her thoughts returned to their more immediate surroundings.
Oh, I was just thinking we might get to meet the ship's cat when we search the galley. You said you heard movement in there, didn't you?
The doctor half smiled. I certainly did say that, he agreed cautiously. As luck would have it, they had now arrived at the dark and open door to the galley. Since it was night on board ship, the kitchen lights were extinguished, the only light to see by being whatever filtered in from the already dim corridor. Carefully, for fear of tripping in the dark and sending crockery and pans flying, they crept into the small galley compartment. From what they could make out, the entirety of the far wall was taken up by a cooker, sink, and storage area for both comestibles and cookware. Between that and the corridor wall was a long, narrow food preparation table made of polished steel, to judge from the few reflections which could be made out upon its surface. The doctor and Romana headed round the nearest end of the table, making for the oven and sink, while Nathan crept along between the table and the corridor wall. The doctor carefully reached for the oven door as Romana crouched down to check under the sink. Just as the doctor cracked open the cooker, the two Time Lords were distracted by a slight stumbling noise and a muttered curse from Nathan Ivon. They both turned in his direction and stood up. The detective had been stooping over on the other side of the table, his fedora-topped head now twisted to face the doctor and Romana.
Well, I guess I found the cat,
he told them flatly. As he did so, he held something aloft, dangling from his right hand. Given he was in shadow, he was practically in silhouette. This included the object he was holding. From what they could see, it looked for all the world like a snake. With a slow, creeping horror, the two Time Lords realized it was a cat's tail.
Where's the rest of it?
Romana cried, more than a little upset. Nathan waggled his head and shrugged.
a mystery I'd like to get to the bottom of too,
he confessed. Meanwhile, the doctor had made a discovery of his own. I've just found the light switch, he told them grimly. Perhaps, with more illumination, we can see how the cat met its end, or even what met the end of the cat. He flicked the switch on in time to catch Romana's look of disapproval at his grim wordplay. There was a clatter of pots and pans from next to Romana's legs as something burst out of the storage area next to the sink, sending those pots and pans flying in all directions. They could not get a good look at the cause, what with the flying kitchen equipment and the speed with which it leapt under the central table, but they were left with a couple of disturbing impressions. Firstly, the thing seemed to be roughly the size of a Barbary ape or bonobo, certainly no bigger. Secondly, it appeared to have smooth or possibly slightly textured grey skin, almost like that of a shark. Now the thing was crashing through the crockery and other kitchen supplies as it tore through the space under the floor preparation table. As it flew out of the other side, it partially collided with one of Nathan's legs, the force of it nearly knocking him off his feet. He retained his balance, however, though whether he felt himself fortunate in this regard was hard to say, as he shared one final nightmarish vision with the Time Lords. The thing had stopped in the doorway of the galley for just a second, to stare back at the three companions. It opened its mouth and uttered a chilling, hissing scream at the trio. Now they could not deny the horror of what they saw. Its body was indeed not unlike that of a bonobo chimp, the same stringy and powerful musculature, the same number and approximate proportion of limbs. One fundamental difference, which had already been glimpsed, was that it was utterly hairless. Its skin looked even more shark-like now it was stationary in the stronger light. While its hands and feet or paws were also vaguely chimp-like, with sizable claws at the end of each digit, It also had quite unsimian webbing between those fingers and toes. Yet all this weirdness paled into insignificance compared to the features of its face. Although totally bald, with not even a central ridge from which Albion hair fronds grew, and its ears were perhaps a little longer and more pointed than might be expected, there was an uncanny and disturbing familiarity about those features. Oversized bared fangs aside, the creature undeniably bore the face of Nathan Aeonne. The private investigator half collapsed against the central table, clutching at it for support. As he did so, the creature haired off on all fours with lightning speed towards the front of the ship. Moments later, Lou, Timmy and Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's skidded to a halt in the galley doorway.
What the hell is that?
Lou cried in disgust. Nathan shook his head in a daze.
We both kept one foot on the floor at all times.
He mumbled to himself in shocked disbelief, barely coherent. The doctor walked over to him and gripped his left shoulder firmly, as if seeking to anchor him to reality. I think you need to sit down. I would suggest in the observation lounge, and I think you might also need a drink. I know you have a lot of explaining to do. Nathan Aeonne, P.I., sat staring into a glass of whiskey, a drink obviously inspired by an earth drink of a similar name, and one which equally clearly had been designed to have the same effect. So far, however, it had utterly failed to loosen the tongue of poor, shattered Nathan Aeonne.
What was that thing?
Snapped Timmy.
And why the devil did it have your face, man?
This was the most animated anyone had seen Timmy since the recent death of his wife, Penny, killed tragically by Dr. Nugati's unnatural, half Albion, half cat manservant. It was clear this renewed vigour was fueled by anger, though whether this was simply triggered by the associations with another horrific half Albion-looking creature or something deeper, it was not yet clear. Nathan glanced up, but did not otherwise respond to Timmy's fiery inquiry. The doctor sat opposite Nathan, studying him intently, while sipping a tea. The drinks had been provided by Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's, who remained floating around the table just in case his services were required. The doctor was actually quite glad of this. At least he had not shown the presence of mind to inform the captain. One less complication to worry about. Tell us what happened in Croydon Aerodrome, the doctor said simply to the detective. Nathan's eyes widened and his head snapped up.
How did you know?
He asked incredulously.
How could you know?
The doctor gave a secret smile. I hardly know anything, he said with uncharacteristic modesty. But I'm afraid you've been letting slip too many fragments of information. I was bound to put all those twos together. They make quite a sum, you know. Nathan frowned at him, unbelieving. The doctor decided to offer him a little more. I remember how dishevelled you were when we ran into you in the corridor in Croydon Aerodrome, far more ruffled than even your usual self. And your demeanour suggested you had had quite an encounter, though at the time I was not sure of what sort. Now I have stronger suspicions. Nathan lowered his eyes and shook his head.
It was supposed to be a secret. I gave my word not to tell a soul.
The doctor waggled his head. Well, it seems a little late for that now. The cat is well and truly out of the bag. Or in this case, the cat has been eaten by whatever was let out of the bag. Wearing your face, by the way. Perhaps I can start you off on your tale, and you can either correct me if I'm wrong, or elaborate upon the details. Nathan looked dubious but curious, and nodded his assent. Well, the first thing, which can hardly be a surprise, is that you met Marina Delamere in Croydon Aerodrome's back offices and got on very well.
Very well?
Philip Leslie's chipped in, confused. Very well indeed, the doctor confirmed significantly. Nathan shook his head with weary resignation.
You guess very well, but you said the first thing. Do you have a second?
For you, all the time in the world. But this particular second is the nature of Miss Delamere. She is not Albion or Chiroan. She is not of your species at all. Or even, I would guess, wholly of this universe. Here Nathan's mouth fell open again.
I made an understatement when I said you guess very well,
he said, shocked.
Yes, I don't need to correct you. but I see now I do have to explain myself.
The doctor nodded, giving him the space to expand. Romana, Lou and Timmy all sat round watching the detective with differing expressions ranging from curiosity through mild disgust to simmering fury.
Yes, we had an encounter, and during that meeting I learned many things I barely understood, many I don't think I did at all, and many more I wish I'd never learnt. Oh, the things I wish I could unhear and unsee!
He and Nathan collapsed back in his seat, shaking his head. Then he took a sizable gulp of his whiskey and found the strength to continue.
She told me about the bulk and those creatures that dwell there. Things which at the time made almost no sense to me, but which all our subsequent adventures have just reinforced the truth of. After all, it was only yesterday we were all in the bulk.
Romana nodded and sought to guide his tale a little.
Is Perina de la Mer being known as the Devil of the Sea by any chance? And if so, what were her plans for you, for us, for this system? And how did he involve Nugati?
Nathan nodded gravely.
You and the doctor clearly know a great deal. Yes, that is her people. They are somehow tied to those gods or bulk entities, like those Nugati spoke of, Ichthultu, Setesh and the rest. She told me some of these were trying to break into our universe, or consume it. I'm not clear on the details.
Of course, the doctor said softly, with some sympathy. Some things you were never meant to know. Nathan smiled grimly.
And yet cannot be unknown. Yes, although Marina was bound to these things, it seems she found our worlds, our universe, amusing. Didn't want them destroyed, not while she was having her fun anyway. So she said she would help us, help me, as long as I kept it secret from you all. I suppose she thought the things she told me were that help, for all the good it's done me.
The doctor frowned. Now, let's not be too hasty in dismissing her aid. She made mention of Nugati, I believe. How does he fit into this? What does he hope to achieve? Nathan gave a twisted half-smile.
Yeah, I guess she did give me that,
he said with a grim chuckle.
Apparently, immortality, or his version of it, wasn't enough for him. He's after power, unspeakable power, and has allied himself with Ichthultu or its agents to get it. He is working with them to release this bulk entity into our universe.
Now it was the doctor and Romana's turn to look shocked.
But that's insane!
Romana cried.
Doesn't he realize that would mean the end of our universe as it is consumed by the bulk entity? And he gets consumed along with it. Where's the gain for him?
Nathan chuckled grimly once more.
I guess he thinks those bulk guys look after their own. I'm also guessing he has no idea he's not one of their own. They probably don't even know he exists.
The doctor nodded. The myopic vision of the power-hungry, he agreed. But still, it seems something has come from your liaison with Marina Delamere after all. We now know something of Nugati's intentions, what we're up against, and what we have to prevent. There was a crash. Timmy Cowley had slammed his own whiskey tumbler down on the table, smashing it to pieces.
Oh, I think more came from that liaison than just tales of the unknown. It looks just like its father, for God's sake.
Timmy spat out contemptuously, rising to his feet.
What a pity Penny isn't here to see this,
he continued, sneering.
She always loved children. What a shame she's not here to play with your darling little offspring.
Lou stood up and pulled Timmy back down into his seat, taking her own again as she did so.
What are you talking about?
She snapped impatiently at him.
We left Croydon Aerodrome less than a week ago. How could that thing possibly be his child?
The doctor found himself reluctantly confirming Timmy's accusation. Unfortunately, Mr. Cowley is factually correct, even if his ire towards Nathan is disproportionate and misplaced. I have little doubt, from the evidence we've seen, Romana and myself, that the gestation period of the devils of the sea are not necessarily bound by Albion or human norms. But as to Nathan's culpability, I suspect they may also have some mind-controlling telepathic abilities which would have made him more amenable. Timmy was clearly still boiling with rage, but for now remained silent. The doctor stood to ensure he had the attention of all. Whatever the origins of this creature, one thing is clear. It cannot be allowed to run free throughout this ship. We have already witnessed its destructive power, and its appetite. Remember the cat. We also have the matter of the missing Marina della Mare. She may be the mother of this thing, but whether she survived the birth, well, who can say? We should certainly try to ascertain her whereabouts. In any event, we shall achieve nothing sitting around here. Everyone looked pensive, each consumed by their own personal preoccupations, as well as the general well-being of the ship.
You mean to trap it?
Nathan inquired softly. The doctor cocked his head at the strangely subdued detective. I doubt we can hope to do much more than that. We're not exactly equipped for big game hunting, he said, trying to sound as good-natured as possible. Timmy Cowley slammed the desk again, this time with the palms of his hands.
Why not?
He yelled angrily.
Nathan has a gun, as do I. Why shouldn't we hunt down and destroy this abomination?
Lou frowned at the security expert, but it was Romana who pointed out the first flaw in his plan.
While there may be firearms available, using projectile weapons on board such a delicate vessel as this is likely to do more harm than good. So far, we've been exceedingly lucky, wouldn't you agree, Sub-Lieutenant?
Sub-Lieutenant Leslies had been standing to the side of the seated party, almost looking as if he was falling asleep where he stood. At the mention of his name, his head snapped up, and his smile flashed into place.
What ho? Eh? Shooting on board ship? Crikey, that does sound a little dicey. I don't think the captain would approve.
Romana nodded in affirmation.
There you have it then. No big game hunting for us, we'll be more like trappers.
The doctor had listened to the whole conversation with rapt attention. Now a broad smile spread across his features. Trappers, indeed. I think I might have the perfect plan, he said smugly. The members of the museum party, plus Sub-Lieutenant Leslies, were now spread around the front part of the gondola. Those furthest back were at the start of the first-class corridor, where it entered the observation lounge. Timmy Cowley blocked this avenue of escape, while slightly further inside the dining area stood Professor Lou Halbert. In the middle of the dining room waited the steward, Philip Leslies. He looked a little lost and unsure of what he was doing. It was almost as if someone had placed him where he would do least harm. Just beyond the twin toilets marking the entrance to the standard-class corridor stood Romana and Nathan. It was they who had acquired the role of seekers, tasked to flush out the beast from wherever it lurked. All had agreed that the thing had last been seen heading forward. Fortunately, the stairs to the main body of the ship had been raised for the night, possibly a new edict from the captain to heighten security in the wake of all the strange occurrences on the voyage so far. The door to the flight deck was naturally securely fastened as Sub-Lieutenant Leslies had left it. Multiple tongue lashings from Captain Povey had at least ingrained this one duty into the habits of the hapless steward. This left the berths of the museum party themselves as the most likely hiding place for the uncanny shark-skinned simian thing. Nathan and Romana nodded to each other grimly and then crept up on the first berth. This happened to house the bunk beds of the doctor and Romana herself. She carefully gripped the edge of one half of the curtain, while Nathan slid his hand next to hers to grasp the other half. Romana mouthed, 1, 2, 3, while counting off the same by extending the thumb and 2 fingers on her other hand. At 3, they both whisked back the curtains. Somewhat anticlimactically, the bunk beds were, while a little untidy, utterly empty of unnatural offspring. In spite of their failure, both Nathan and Romana exhaled short sighs of relief. They then looked at each other and silently agreed to check the berth behind them on the other side of the corridor. There were still several more to search before they reached the door to the bridge. Once again, they each carefully grabbed a curtain and prepared to repeat the procedure. Romana counted silently. 1, 2... The curtains burst open before the count of 3, and a shrieking flying thing leapt upon them. Nathan bore the brunt of the attack. The creature had its webbed, clawed paws around the detective's throat, its teeth gnashing mere millimetres from his face. Nathan's eyes bulged as he found himself utterly unable to breathe. Blood was also seeping from under the creature's hands. It was clear the claws were doing damage. Romana stuffed the brass handle of her sword stick into the thing's mouth in an attempt to prevent it devouring the detective. This spawn of the bulk tainted screamed in furious indignation. it released Nathan's neck and grabbed instead at the cane in its jaws. Romana now found herself wrestling against the entity for control of the weapon. Meanwhile, Nathan collapsed to the floor, choking. The strength of the creature was quite formidable given its size, and to Romana's aching arms it also seemed heavier than it should be. Nevertheless, she was able to swing both the cane and it around her until it was flung free, flying into the dining room.
Quick!
Romana cried.
Herd it this way. Don't let it leave the observation lounge.
The observation lounge come dining room had been laid out for breakfast. This neat and orderly arrangement was quickly dispelled. The creature ran around the room at floor level, knocking tables and chairs flying, crockery and cutlery going with it. At one point, even Sub-Lieutenant Leslie's was sent sailing through the air. Timmy and Lou had apparently agreed to swap positions. Timmy driving in towards the creature, swinging a folded metal chair, while Lou now blocked the corridor to first class. Romana had taken up a defensive position, holding her sword stick like a club, standing just in front of the left-hand toilet door. Nathan appeared beside her in the entrance to the standard class corridor, clutching his bleeding throat. While messy, it seemed his wounds were not life-threatening.
Don't kill it!
He rasped at Timmy.
We're trying to catch it, remember?
Timmy just gave a wordless growl and continued to thrash his chair in the direction of the monster. The right-hand toiletry cubicle was open, and the creature leapt into it, landing inside the generous bowl of the toilet itself. It sat with its forepaws on the rim, glaring at all comers. The creature hissed and screeched, baring its substantial fangs. The doctor leapt from behind the cubicle door and slammed the toilet lid down upon the thing. It just managed to move its paws out of the way before they could be caught or crushed, but this only meant it was now entirely contained within the toilet bowl. The lid was quite a substantial heavy-duty metal hatch, and the doctor sat down upon it to help keep it secure, confident it could bear his weight. He crossed his legs, placed his hands on his knees, and smiled with satisfaction. The smile melted away as he saw Timmy Cowley pelting towards him.
No!
Nathan cried, realizing too late Timmy's intention and too slow to intercept him. Timmy elbowed past the doctor, reaching for the system behind him. He pushed the flush lever. There was a hefty clunk, accompanied by a roaring whoosh. The toilets of the Imperial Space Service ships were of a simple yet effective design. They would only operate once the lid was down, but once secured, they became a primitive airlock. Upon flushing, the bottom of the toilet would fall completely open, while the air, liquids and whatever else was in the toilet would be ejected into space due to the air pressure in the bowl versus the vacuum outside. A motor would then automatically close the bowl again, allowing further usage. Nathan slumped to the floor, his head in his hands.
So that's it. You killed him.
He spat bitterly at Timmy Cowley.
Left him to die in the cold vacuum of space.
Somewhere in the recesses of the first-class corridor came a faint sound like a door opening and closing, probably one of the other passengers roused by the night's raucous shenanigans. Doubtless they too needed the toilet by now, which, for first class, were located at the very rear of the ship, near the secondary set of stairs to the main body of the vessel. Romana had been considering Nathan's words while staring out of the window.
Not necessarily. It seems we've just re-entered atmosphere. The upper reaches at least.
It was true. As they all moved to the windows, the doctor included, they could see the curve of Cairo beneath them. A predominantly sandy globe with sparse seas and rivers, a few shallow time-worn mountain ranges, and one tiny solitary ice cap. Clearly the hemisphere with the snowy pole must be enjoying the planet's winter. The sight of all this planetary splendour and beauty did nothing to lift Nathan's spirits.
So instead of suffocating, he burns up on re-entry, or makes one hell of an impact crater.
The doctor raised a finger. Not necessarily, he began cautiously. We are, after all, talking about a juvenile devil of the sea. Who's to say what means it may have available to slow its descent? I certainly couldn't tell you. All may not be as bleak as you think. Nathan looked far from convinced. Timmy showed no signs of remorse, but, to judge from his expression, neither had his actions granted him the happiness or satisfaction he may have sought. I just wish I knew where the mother had got to. The doctor continued, largely to himself. She might have more valuable information, particularly when it comes to Dr. Nugatti's insane scheme. For the first time in quite a while, Sub-Lieutenant Leslie spoke up, obviously inspired by the opportunity to be useful.
Oh, I say, I suppose she may have gone to her other cabin,
he said thoughtfully. All eyes turned upon him with varying degrees of disbelief.
Other cabin.
Lou said impatiently.
Why on Albia didn't you tell us about that before?
Crikey, it just sort of slipped my mind,
The steward said sheepishly. Where is it? The doctor asked wearily. Largely oblivious to the doctor's tone, Leslie's own voice brightened again at the thought of lending a hand.
Oh, you see, that's why I forgot it was a room. Miss Delamere rented the cabin you saw and the adjoining one. She wanted to use that as extra storage space for costumes and whatnot. At least, I think that's what she said. So you see, I rather saw it more as an extra wardrobe.
The doctor rolled his eyes. Well, perhaps you could take us to this wardrobe and let us in. Who knows what wondrous creatures or lands we may discover? Led by Sub-Lieutenant Leslies, fiddling with his keys, the party re-entered the first-class corridor. They passed the wrecked door to Marina Delamere's main cabin, and then stopped before the next door along. The steward unlocked it, and they all piled inside. The room was much like that next door. There was little evidence of it being repurposed as a walk-in wardrobe. Indeed, it even looked as though this bed had also recently been used. Although it was still made up, it did look as though someone might have been lying or sitting on top of the covers. Beyond this, though, there were still no signs of the elusive Miss Delamere. Romana walked over to the ensuite toiletry cubicle and opened the concertina-like door. She turned to face the doctor.
Doctor, you'd better come and look at this,
she said grimly. The doctor was by her side in a couple of strides as he too stared into the tiny compartment. As well as a small showerhead and sink, there was also a modest square mirror on the ship's wall above the sink. This formed the door of a shallow medicine cabinet. Someone had drawn upon the mirror in red lipstick. On its upper half was a neatly rendered smiley face. A circle formed the head, two smaller circles the eyes, and a simple curved line its smile. There was one feature which looked slightly out of place. Beneath the right eye was a single perfect stylized teardrop, like a raindrop from a weather broadcast. It was also in red lipstick, and the outline was filled in. Beneath the tearful, smiling face, in quite neat legible writing, was a message also in lipstick. For all its simplicity, it caused mounting trepidation in both Romana and the doctor. It read, "Who should I help now?"